Okay, thanks, Geoff. I'm going to briefly describe how we have adopted our stakeholder involvement approach to the needs of systematic reviews and evidence maps. In doing so, actually, I can skip the first two slides, which essentially repeating what I have said before on the basic objectives of stakeholder involvement in the projects and what kind of stakeholders we are targeting and that we are applying actually in open consultation mode. So that's actually the same approach that applies here that we had described before. So using this graph that has been shown by Christian as a starting point, here you can see actually the main stages for stakeholder involvement. This what we can consider of planning the review exercise, and this step eventually in trying to interpret the findings and drawing conclusions. So actually also this approach here mirrors the two-step approach that I've been presenting before that. In reality, in implementing this approach, it was a bit more complex, as you will see in a second. Also, we had a similar way in doing that. We organized 2 workshops, partly linked to written consultations via email. We also had 1 online questionnaire step, and we also in this case had written comments from stakeholders and GRACE team responses, which were depicted in great detail in consultations reports, which are available at the GRACE website. So the input-output scheme here is also mirroring what we had before. Actually, we started with draft documents that were available before the consultation, starting with the general framework, moving into draft review questions, revised list of review questions, and eventually the draft review protocols. So this was several stages actually in the consultation process, and then revising them, coming to final review questions, prioritized list of review questions, and so on. Everything is documented in great detail in the consultation reports, and a similar schematic applies actually to the result stage, where we made available draft reports and draft preliminary general conclusions, recommendations, and eventually then we're revising them into final reports and final general conclusions and recommendations. One qualification that needs to be made here is actually that given the time constraints that we are suffering in the GRACE project, we could not fully consistently apply that approach. For example, we didn't have all the draft reports available at the stage of the consultations, as has already been mentioned in the course of stakeholder consultations many times. We were not granted a cost-neutral extension to our project, so we need to come up with a compromise and go ahead with whatever is available at that time. So this is depicting the flow, the workflow in the project, and shows also the multiple stages in the consultation process. So the first consultation was essentially on the general framework. We adopted existing frameworks of systematic reviews to the needs of GMO impact research and assessment. We actually were already formulating some review questions, and we're discussing them. The next step was actually then to, based on that discussion, develop a list of a kind of revised list of review questions, including also reformulating review questions, and these were put to a prioritization exercise where stakeholders were asked to prioritize the review questions that we came up with in order to help us selecting the most relevant ones. And these, based on the selection of the most relevant questions, we were then moving into the elaboration of protocols. These are detailed work plans, how to conduct the systematic reviews and the evidence maps. We also had a consultation step on that. And eventually, at the very final stage, we had a consultation step on the results of all these individual reviews and evidence maps, and as well as on the overall conclusions and recommendations on the use of evidence synthesis methods in the course of GM impact assessment and research. So on the right-hand side, you will see also figures indicating the participation. As you can see, it was a very long and elaborate and partly exhausting planning stage consultation. So the number of stakeholder participants is declining over time. But still, we received also here a lot of partly quite detailed comments, all of which has been responded to and are available at the GRACE website. And this was actually a huge task, in particular also in that particular stage here, where we were actually elaborating a total of 14 review protocols, subjecting them to stakeholder review, and we received here, for example, a total of more than 300 comments on 11 of our 14 protocols. So this is the overall schematic and indicating also the feedback and response. In terms of participation, this is a similar picture emerges as we had actually in with the previous work stream on the feeding studies and alternative studies. We largely managed to have actually all major stakeholders represented over the various consultation steps, with the possible exception of this written consultation and the draft review protocols, with a strong interest from the competent authorities. Also a very similar picture emerging here as we had before. So just to illustrate also how stakeholder comments have been processed, and at that point I'm taking examples from the planning stage consultation. For example, on the prioritization of review questions. So we moved into that consultation with candidate review questions that would then actually frame the various reviews or evidence maps. In this case, we had 4 potential review questions suggested for to focus on compositional analysis aspects. And from these four questions were subjected to a stakeholder ranking, and I'm just showing a simplified picture to you here as actually, and when in this case we could clearly identify a highest ranking question that were then put to processed further, and based on additional stakeholder comments, this question was eventually then reformulated and the review protocol was developed. And you saw the results of these questions, of these evidence maps, will be presented to you, I believe, after lunch. On the level of review protocols, the comments were partly on very detailed and partly very technically, as indicated here on this slide. You probably cannot read that, but it's just to illustrate that. For example, here it's in the course of the systematic review that has already been mentioned by Christian as an example. Does the growing of PDMAs change population ecological functions of non-target animals compared to the growing of conventional GMAs? For example, the one comment was actually whether the population in field margin will be included or not be included. So we had a clarification response on that, for example, or actually here also whether the cultivation and management practice used with PDMAs. So there was a question about the cultivation management practices used with PDMAs. And in this case, it was clearly stated, for example, that other management practices are not in the focus of the review, and this will be made explicit in the review protocol. So there are more examples in here. With another example here was also on field margins, why field margins are being included, because allegedly the objective is to evaluate the effects of botanical diversity on wheat populations in farmland. There is no reference to margin, and here we actually clarified that field margins are considered to be part of farmland, for example. Another example actually is about the type of evidence that's being considered, where one comment actually was alluding to the fact that actually data should not be included if they are not peer reviewed. And we made clear that actually it's peer review, it's not a requirement and not a necessary requirement for data to enter the process of systematic review or evidence maps. It's particularly, as has been highlighted before, also aiming to include gray literature, but the gray literature will actually subjected to the same appraisal steps as the peer-reviewed literature, and only at that step actually there will be this kind of quality assessment. So there is a dedicated quality assessment. We don't necessarily need to peer review to consider that before. Yes, with this illustrative example, I again would like to acknowledge the team, and in particular here these almost 100 stakeholder representatives that have over a period of 3.5 years actually discussed these issues with us and submitted written comments. Thank you very much.